Hello and welcome to this video, which is all around the risk type compass and boards. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Elliot Phillips. I am one of the consultant psychologists here at PCL, and my focus really is around the risk type compass assessment, both in terms of training people up on how to use the assessment, getting involved in product development, as well as then going out and using the risk type compass within our consultancy projects as well. And what we've seen a steady increase in particularly over the last year, is the use of the risk type compass in the boardroom. So what we wanted to do, sort of given this knowledge and experience that we've got in using the risk type compass in that context, was to pull together some of our insights and share those with you so that hopefully you can start to see the value of using the risk type compass within the boardroom and potentially use it yourself as well. So in the next half an hour or so, what I'm going to do is start off with talking around risk and decision making within the boardroom, what are board responsibilities, why is decision making so crucial in those contexts. Then I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of the risk type compass. For those of you who are already certified, it will serve as a brief refresher. And for those of you who haven't had any experience with the risk type compass before, hopefully it gives you enough of an insight to start to understand what I'm then going to move into, which is how do we use the risk type compass in the boardroom or at a board level, both with individuals and with groups. And as I go through that, you'll see me dip into a case study of ours with an organisation we've worked with within the last year in the UK, who adopted what we call a risk type approach to how the board actually approached setting strategy in particular. So look forward to that. Beginning then with some of this context, I should really just caveat before we dive in here that decision making is present and deeply consequential across all levels of any organization, but the potent importance of decision making and the factors that influence it are arguably most consequential at the board level. The decisions that boards make impact a myriad of business functions. They shape the trajectory of the organization, requiring a delicate balance of foresight, responsibility, and innovation. So while we're here, I just wanted to highlight some of the responsibilities of a board and the immediate relevance to their decision making, and more specifically their decision making processes, before we then head into the world of risk type. So the first point that I have on screen here is that boards set the strategic direction for an organization. They need to ensure that the decisions that they make drive long-term success and sustainability for the organization that they are boarding or steering. And like I say, the strategy setting is actually the context that I'm going to come back to when I get into the case study a little bit later on. The second point here is that they're also accountable for governance, ensuring that decisions that they make and the organization makes comply with legal, ethical, and regulatory standards. So it's remarkably high stakes. There's legal accountability here. And so for that reason, examining the way in which they make decisions and understanding the different factors at play should be at the top of the agenda for a serious board. And the last point here, and it's the last of many board functions that I could touch on, but I just want to mention this one briefly, is around risk management. Now, managing risk is a whole profession, but the board are ultimately responsible for the performance of an organization. And the important relationship with risk here is that it isn't something to be eradicated. David Koenig is president and CEO of the DCRO Institute and has written extensively on the relationship that boards have with risk. One of his quotes that we really like here at PCL is that risk is a scarce resource. They need to keep on innovating to avoid dwindling and going down as an organization. So again, what it's about here is identifying risk and trying to work with it and to recognize the opportunity that comes when you take risk, rather than just trying to minimize it and eradicate it out of their processes or out of the way in which they make decisions. Now, I talk about making decisions quite a lot in that sort of, last slide. The reason being is that decisions are only made because uncertainty is involved. When there is uncertainty, there is not a singular solution, and that's why risk and decision making are ubiquitously intertwined. You cannot talk about decision making without thinking about risk, and when you think about risk and uncertainty, there's going to be a decision that you have to make in terms of how you interact with that uncertainty. And yet, in all of our conversations that we tend to have around risk, there's often a focus on numbers, on things like predictive models, quantifying likely outcomes, and just generally an emphasis on objective risk. But there's all too often a missing component, or at best underrepresented, and that's the human factor. Decisions are made by people. Policies are processed by people, and data is understood and applied by people. So, just to be more specific on that, when I talk about the human factor, the overlooked component is diversity among people, how we differ in personality and temperament. Do we have a need for structure versus flexibility? From individual to individual, what are their respective levels of comfort with uncertainty? How reactive is each individual towards information and events that go on? Research both within and outside of the world of psychology has found that individual difference is a driving force for organizational performance. One paper that I'll just sort of quickly reference and walk you through is called The Wolves of Wall Street. This is run by economists who looked at the factors that predicted and influenced the business models adopted by 165 different banks in the States. The study took place over 18 years, had over 1,500 bank managers, and they were trying to look for the most predictive factors in influence on the business models. And they were thinking, is it going to be compensation, financial incentives, and other observable variables? What they found was that those variables account for about 4% of the variance in the models adopted, but that there was this X factor, and the X factor accounted for 72% of the variance in the models adopted. This caused them to look further into what this X factor is, and they ended up labeling it fixed manager attributes, which we would argue is indicative of personality, this instinctive response that the bank managers had as they moved from one bank to the next towards risk, and the crucially impactful consequences that has on behavior and on the models therefore adopted by those banks as well. These differences, our individual differences, are innate and permanent. They're deeply rooted within us and they're intransient. We carry our own unique dispositions from one context to the next. They are the undercurrent of decision making, and it makes it clear that risk is dependent upon the person whose hands it's within. So you can start to see why it's so crucial to focus on this component of decision making and of risk. But it then begs the question as to why this pivotal component of decision making has been ignored, or at best underrepresented. And for us, it links back to a quote by Peter Drucker, which is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And the subjective side of risk, the human side of risk, is often quite hard to get your head around because it can feel a little bit abstract and really hard to be tangible and to hold on to and sink your teeth into. But that's where PCL come in. So our dedication has been to try and understand individual differences in disposition and how those impact then a variety of different business functions. We provide clarity on the human factors in decision making in a way that is measurable and that is also robust and reliable. So the risk type compass in particular taps into the interpersonal chemistry of teams and decision making. And it does this by measuring individuals' levels of emotionality as well as their natural disposition cognitively. These two factors are fundamental to the way in which we make decisions, and everybody will sit somewhere on each of those scales. Now you'll see a graphic on screen. Running from top left to bottom right, we have emotionality. Now that ranges from being really quite sensitive at one end, up in the top left. These individuals are going to be passionate and enthusiastic, but also apprehensive or nervous about risk. They're quite alert to threat or potential errors. Whereas down at the other end, down at bottom right, that sensitivity is dialed back or dialed down. They're less reactive and usually seen as being quite composed and quite optimistic. Now, for that reason, they're often considered to be resilient by other people, but with that sort of lack of reactivity, they can also be perceived as being apathetic because they're not sort of displaying that sense of urgency when things start to go wrong. Similarly, cognition ranges from top right to bottom left. Now, those on the top right, we talk about as having high scores on cognition, which, when I say cognition here, you could change that phrase with the degree to which somebody needs to know. How much do they need to know? So those on the top right are those who need a lot of structure and a lot of detail. These are the individuals who want to have plans and procedures in place before they carry something out. And then that stretches down to those in the bottom left who enjoy ambiguity and spontaneity, sort of being innovative and not needing to have certainty in the decisions that they arrive at. Now, because each of us has a position on each of those scales and any combination is possible, you can essentially multiply emotionality by cognition. This is what results in the vast diversity in our approaches to uncertainty and to risk. Nature has turned us into a think tank which leverages diversity of perspectives and enables solutions to problems which could not be discovered by any one perspective alone. Now, when I'm saying that you can multiply emotionality by cognition here, just worth quickly noting, you can't just take any two variables and cross them. There is empirical support for doing so with the risk type compass, and that's deeply significant and essential to understanding our differences in relation to risk taking and decision making. The correlation between emotion and cognition in the data set that we have, which is of over 20,000 people, is 0.007. So it is empirically as close to orthogonal as you can realistically get with two variables. So that's why we sit them at 90 degrees to one another. And that's why when you start to consider the combinations of emotionality and cognition, the array is simply vast. All of that being said, the risk type compass then allocates this spectrum of perspectives into 8 risk types and an axial group. So it's a risk type taxonomy. The people side of risk can be difficult to comprehend and to process, but the risk type compass provides a perspective that makes tangible sense of the people side of risk and captures the diversity among people rather than ignoring it. Now, within the spectrum of the risk type compass, there is no better or worse risk type. There are direct and undeniable strengths and drawbacks that belong to each of the risk types. Now, we can tell this by the extraordinary finding that there are roughly equal proportions within each risk type. This was not an expected finding. In fact, it's quite remarkable. The slices on screen are graphically representative of their proportion of the pie. You'll notice that axial aren't present on the graphic. They account for about 10% of the population as well. But what we're seeing here is equal representation of each of the risk types in the general population. Evolutionarily speaking, every risk type has served its purpose for Team Homo sapiens, and that's the name we give to this graphic, is Team Homo sapiens. That's why we've been able to not only survive as a species, but been able to thrive. It's made us very effective. What this graphic's really doing is highlighting the benefits of diversity of thought. And it makes sense. We need people to be risk averse, sort of knowing something will be dangerous and that we shouldn't do it. But we also need some people to be intrepid, going and looking for new adventures, someone to volunteer, try new things and discover advancements. No one of these perspectives is right. We're each different and necessary for sort of group success. The other takeaway from this graphic is that you, individually, are meaningfully different to more than 80% of the population. Every perspective on the risk type compass every risk type has a unique vantage point or unique perspective on risk and uncertainty. And knowing that more than 80% of the population sit elsewhere on the compass, what that says is that you belong to a small group with your unique perspective on uncertainty and on risk. So you can start to now project forward and think about why that's so crucial to understand what that perspective is and to hold sort of accountability in bringing that perspective to the table in the boardroom. So for individuals specifically here, in terms of application then around the risk type compass and boardrooms, the individual application of the risk type compass facilitates an opportunity to recognize and understand your own disposition towards uncertainty and how you approach decisions. Individuals can map and detail their natural strengths, their problem-solving style, and identify when these strengths are best leveraged. In tandem with this, it will naturally highlight an individual's shortcomings. What you are defines what you're not. When I say that, what I mean here is you'll be very similar on the compass to your neighbors, to the people either side of you on the compass, and you'll be least like the people on the opposite side of the compass. So what this provides an opportunity for is for an individual to increase the level of strategic self-awareness and then build development goals upon that accordingly. So, for example, this individual on screen at the moment is an adventurous risk type. If we relate this back to the two underlying scales, they're low on emotionality, so they'll rarely worry about things nor easily become apprehensive. They will seem to be comfortable in taking risks that would unnerve other people. And this will create a reputation of resilience, calmness, optimism, and confidence for them. Now, cognitively, they're daring. What I mean by that is they will find rules and procedures tiresome. They'll question the way in which things are done. In fact, they'll probably look for new ways of doing things and seek opportunity in times of uncertainty and ambiguity. And the way in which they pursue those new, bold ventures will be with a high degree of composure and self-assurance from the emotionality side. Their unique combination of spontaneity and fearlessness enables them to be imperturbable, intrepid explorers who keep their nerve. So as a board member, what this person would be very good at is approaching strategy, for example, as a big picture thinker. They're going to advocate change for an organization in a way that may unnerve other people. However, they may be impatient with bureaucracy and routine tasks, and they're not going to have an affinity for detail or planning that would belong to the opposite side of the compass from where they sit. So there are consequential up and downsides to each risk type, and these have potent implications at the individual level. Rolling up from here then, once you understand yourself, you're in a better position to understand and engage with others. Now, the risk type compass can be used to map a team's risk types and elevate our understanding of those that we work closely with. So thinking about boards again here, you can identify group dynamics in the boardroom and examine where you may have an overrepresentation or perhaps even an underrepresentation of particular dispositions. We call this risk polarization. Having risk polarization can be indicative of a potential for groupthink, poor communication, or blind spots within a team and shortcomings to be aware of. Exploring these topics enables a focused and guided dissection of board composition that's essential in order to understand who's at the table, how can we manage this array of dispositions, and subsequently, how can we generate holistic decision making. The risk type compass team graphics, which you're seeing on screen now, are a catalyst for change because we're tackling what's going wrong often in groups, which is that interpersonal chemistry that can exist. So I'm going to take a moment now, sort of thinking about the individual and particularly this team level insight for risk type, to walk you through a recent case study of ours. We recently got invited to attend a board team day for an educational institution in the UK. This organization has undergone a great deal of change in the last 4 years, and they're about to set their strategy for the upcoming 4 years. Preparing for this, the board wanted to understand what the perspectives were at the table in the boardroom. So each board member took the risk type compass assessment, and we explored the results at individual and group level in a workshop with all of these members. So I'm going to give you a moment to look at this graphic, look at the array of risk types, and just see what you think. There is a lot of information to dissect, and ultimately a lot of insight and value for this particular board. So firstly though, if I want to try and break this down for you, let's start with a positive. There is representation of every single risk type within this board, with the exception of the axial group. So the potential exists for this board to leverage a diversity of perspectives when approaching decision making, or specifically in this case, setting strategy. However, what you can start to see is a bit of a bald spot on the top left of the compass. If we ignore for a moment the two individuals that sit in wary, what you can see is that almost everybody on the compass sits towards the middle or the bottom right. Now, link this back to the two underlying scales that I went over a moment ago, and this tells us that on the emotional scale, there are only two individuals that represent higher levels of emotional sensitivity. The majority of the group will not share feelings of apprehension, nervousness, or sensitivity towards threat. And if the two individuals who are in the top left corner don't speak up, this perspective will be missing entirely from discussions in the boardroom. When we work with clients, it can be tempting to dive straight into the risk type data, but it can be remarkably insightful to ask how long each board member has been on the board, how much experience each of them have in their careers, before we do that, to get some of that contextual information. Who is it that's more likely to be dominant in discussions? Who is it that's more likely to assertively project their opinion? Before we get into the risk type data, to get a feel for, amongst members, who tends to be most influential, who tends to hold back a little bit more. The third insight I just want to extract from this graphic is that if we consider the other scale, cognition, running from bottom left to top right, this board has a high degree of representation across the breadth of this scale. There are several individuals who are more comfortable with uncertainty, down towards the bottom left, who can work with ambiguity, don't require planning or detail to feel comfortable with a solution. And there are also several people at the other end. We don't know from this graphic alone if that diversity of perspective is being utilized, but this board is not subject to risk polarization because we do have that spread in particular across the cognition scale and possibly across the emotionality scale as well, just slightly less. What I really enjoyed about this particular project is that the senior leadership team were also present at this board away day. Now, it's the senior team who execute the strategy. They're involved in running the organization on a day-to-day basis. The board, for that reason, wanted to include their perspectives in considering what the strategy should be for the next 4 years, and credit to them for that. Now, again, I'm just going to give you a moment here to examine the senior team's risk type compass graphic. If you want to pause the video to really sink your teeth in and make your own conclusions, go for it. And then I'll walk you through our interpretation and takeaways from this graphic in particular. Similar to the board, they have a representation of all risk types. Now, this group doesn't actually work as a single unit. They're more of a cohort than a team. But when brought together at events such as this team development day, the diversity of perspectives will be remarkably apparent. What's particularly striking about this graphic is that there are several members who represent emotionality who live up in the top left corner of the compass, and certainly far more than we saw on the board. The senior team as a whole are more likely, therefore, to feel things vividly. Apprehension around uncertainty, sensitivity towards threat or potential errors. And the last thing I want to highlight here is that the executive team are present in both groups. So I've just highlighted those individuals for you. They're the main vehicle for communication between the board and the senior team. So because of this, I find it really interesting if we highlight who those 6 individuals are. The main dynamic, which I've now highlighted a couple of times, is the underrepresentation of emotionality at the board level in combination with a high representation of emotionality within the senior team. Considering that the executive team are the vehicle for communication between the two, there's a real challenge here. The executive team need to be careful to accommodate and represent the perspectives of the more emotional senior team members. Their sensitive and astute nature is remarkably helpful in spotting potential issues early on, and these insights should be invaluable to the board. Similarly, sort of thinking now about communication in the other direction, when the strategy is being communicated back to the senior team, the executive managers need to be careful not to appear too matter-of-fact, unreactive, or unappreciative of the impact that this strategy or change may have on others just because they're particularly resilient or stoic themselves. These are some of the high-level takeaways from this team event, the actionable outcomes taken by those in the room. And these included sort of commitments to seeking out the advice or input from other people who they now know have a different perspective to their own. So not just in experience or background, but in terms of their fundamental dispositions. And actually, the board chair put their hand up when we were doing a wash up from this exercise and said, actually, you know what, for me, I now know that I sit in X position on the compass. I'm aware of some of my colleagues who sit elsewhere, and I want to make more of an intentional effort to reach out to them when going through a thought process or making particular decisions. They also wanted to intentionally try to adapt their communication style as to accommodate other people's risk types, as well as to hold one another accountable for sharing that unique perspective when in their group-based discussions. So when I mentioned earlier on the Team Homo sapiens graphic, and you have a fundamentally unique perspective on decision making, as in, 80% of the population have a different perspective than your own. As a ramification of that, this group wanted to therefore say, well, how do we hold each other accountable for this? How do we make sure that each individual is bringing that unique perspective to the table? While this slide is up, I just want to mention something that we talk about a lot at PCL. We work a lot with boards, and as many of you will know, one responsibility of a board is to write a risk statement. Now, usually this is along the lines of, we take XYZ stance on risk across our organization. We beg the question, how do you know what your organization is doing in relation to risk? Well, we know what this organization are like around risk at a board, executive management, and a senior management level. It's on the screen. There's a balance of various perspectives here, driven by an equal representation of diverse viewpoints. In terms of what this might look like at a broader, more organizational level, I'm going to come back to in just a moment. Now, this is the slide that I actually used at the board team event with this client. When we were summarizing the team session, the only thing I've changed for the video is to take out the organization's name and replace it with this client. But otherwise, the result of our time with this board was that, look, immediate harmony is not the priority for an effective board. If you're immediately in harmony with each other, you've either got artificial harmony because people with different opinions are just keeping their mouths closed, or everybody really is on the same page, and what you've got there is a result of things like groupthink. You're not exploring what alternatives are fully, and you're not having holistic decision making. So rather than seek out individuals who will back you up and agree, respect others' viewpoints and encourage an exploration of the diverse perspectives in the room and guide that by risk type. It's like, Elliot, we haven't heard from you yet. We know that you have X perspective. What are your thoughts on the current topic we're talking about? So you use it as a framework to allow you to navigate different perspectives and make sure you're gaining sort of multiple viewpoints on the topic that you're discussing. The aim for this board was to utilize the diversity of perspectives that they have. And so for them, it was okay. You know that from the risk type compass, you have a broad perspective, a broad variety of risk types in your boardroom. How do you create the environments that are rooted in mutual respect and team dynamics that allow you to utilize that diversity in the formation and execution of the strategy that they were going to build for then the next 4 years? Ultimately, their aim was to move towards navigating difference rather than avoiding or ignoring it. Now, to bring this back then to the third level of application, one thing you can take further from a team level of analysis with sort of the risk type compass profiling is that we can look at how groups compare and contrast from one another. This organizational overview creates an empirical mapping of risk dispositions and of a business's stakeholder groups. Really what this is a bottom-up approach to measuring risk culture. There's a popular view in psychology that's that people make the place. By assessing individual risk profiles and risk type compass data at an individual level, you can begin to aggregate that data to capture the network of risk dispositions across the organization. From there, you can then use this to pinpoint teams that have greater levels of things like resistance to change and understand what it is that drives that resistance or that hesitance. What I haven't got on screen is the key for this graphic. Now, if you essentially take the two axes on the compass and close them into a vertical line, you get a composite scale for risk tolerance. We call it the risk tolerance index. Those who are further north on the compass are more risk averse, and those who are further south on the compass are more risk tolerant. Taking that singular sort of vertical line, the graphic you're seeing on screen now places a darker orange color for those who are more risk tolerant and a darker blue color for those who are more risk averse. So what you can start to see are the different levels of risk tolerance across these teams in an organization. The insights we get here are how teams or sort of different business units in an organization approach things like change or uncertainty. You can also see through the connecting lines which groups interact. What might the challenges involved be? Is there tension between preferred styles or blind spots perhaps in communication due to homogeneity of perspective? Are they having risk polarization among different groups as well? And it also gives us a lens into how we can begin to tailor communication to the decision-making dispositions of each of these stakeholder groups. The breadth of insight and impact available here all hinges on addressing the people side of risk rather than ignoring it. Having people take the risk type compass provides you with a lens into subjective risk. Human factors in decision making are a knowable unknown, and it really opens the door to tap into collective potential once you understand disposition around risk and what the composition of risk types looks like in a boardroom as well as in a broader organization. Just to summarize then the points we've been over in this video, we firstly touched on sort of the connections that boards have to decision making and that it's inextricably linked. What they do and the demands upon a board are so heavily focused around how they make decisions and the process that goes into decision making. We then spoke about how the risk type compass provides that window into understanding the human side of risk and to the human factors involved in decision making, as well as then how boards can use that insight at an individual level, at an intra-team level, and at a inter-team level as well. I hope you found this video to be useful. If you have any further questions or if you want to continue the conversation further, please do get in touch. We're always happy to talk about anything risk type. Contact our team using any of the details on screen and we'll be more than happy to help you.